if the USC Notre Dame football series is on the verge of maybe ending, I'd say that's our number one topic. I'd say that should dominate the conversation. So that's going to be our main story tonight here on the Voice of College Football. And so, Ethan, we're going to dive into the details, going to peel away the layers of the onion. Just before coming on the air, I saw Ryan Karchi with a story from the Los Angeles Times saying this is Jen Cohen taking a hard line in negotiations with Notre Dame. So people thinking this is Lincoln Riley being a softy, afraid of competition. Ryan Karchi is reporting. Hey, Ryan Karchi, in my mind, very solid, reputable USC beat writer for the LA Times. Like, he doesn't throw Molotov cocktails. He's a nuts and bolts reporter. If he and he just reported in a pretty straightforward, direct way. Jen Cohen is taking the hard line in negotiations here. So, in terms of conspiracy theories about Lincoln or other figures, this really seems to be Jen Cohen's issue, and Jen Cohen is taking it upon herself to try and put USC in what she thinks is the best possible position. Now, we're going to debate that. We're going to litigate that. But let's just start with the significance of Jen Cohen, by all appearances, being the person who's really taking charge of this and who is kind of driving USC's hard line in this Notre Dame situation.
Well, I'm going to start off in defense of Jen Cohen because I think from the same outlet, LA Times, I saw something a little bit earlier in the week that the whole reason why is because USC wants the way that college football playoff automatic bids work qualified a little bit. And, we saw that a lot last year, a really heated debate about whether or not records should matter more, whether or not conference records should matter more, whether or not top 25 wins should matter more, all these things factoring in. Obviously, Notre Dame is a completely different beast in terms of that scenario, given that they don't have a conference. They kind of determine basically their own schedule every year. And so the article went on to say that USC is trying to extend the rivalry by 1 year, and Notre Dame isn't really interested in any short-term extensions. They want a long-term extension. So from that perspective, I guess it kind of makes sense. I can see where Cohen and some of these other USC bigwigs are coming from, that, you want to give your program as good of a chance as anybody to get into the college football playoff, and you don't want to give rivals, long-standing rivals like Notre Dame, a better chance of getting into the college football playoff. So, holding out on the historic rivalry, it makes sense from that perspective, that very unemotional, very strategic perspective. But that's kind of the extent of the defense that I'm going to give it in this situation, because honestly, I think that, and I said this a couple weeks ago when the rumors started circulating, I think that backing out of the Notre Dame rivalry is pretty cowardly, to be honest with you. I think that, in the midst of stronger USC teams, in the midst of like the Pete Carroll dynasty, this wouldn't even be a conversation because USC would be winning a lot of these Notre Dame games. I think, to be honest with you, a lot of the reason the conversation has intensified is because that USC's had so much struggle against Notre Dame recently, and that, USC seems to want to position themselves with some less difficult out-of-conference games so that they can have a better record and, kind of walk into the college football playoff. And I just think that that's not what USC football is about. That's never what USC football has been about. And there's a real identity, whether, USC fans like it or not, that has arisen for USC out of this USC Notre Dame rivalry that they'd be kind of shedding if they moved away from it, which is, we don't back down from anybody. This is, I think there's double-digit national championships between these two programs combined. So these are two of the historically the best college football franchises going back and forth, and it's must-see TV. It either happens in the middle of October or Thanksgiving weekend, depending on where the location is. It's historically been a fixture of the college football schedule, and I I understand from a purely strategic perspective, like I said, if you're Jen Cohen, you're looking at the new college football playoff rules, which are a little murky. You want to more easily get your program into the college football playoff, how that makes sense. But you just lose so much identity, you lose so much history, and you lose so much about what college football is about, and you lose so much about what the USC program has historically been about, which is we don't back down from anybody. We we weren't backing down when we joined the Big Ten. It was obvious that was going to be a tougher thing schedule-wise year in and year out. Obviously, the last year of the Pac-12 was a gauntlet, but that was the exception rather than the rule in the last 10, 20 years of the Pac-12. So, we weren't exactly running from anybody when we did that. So why we would run from anybody now, I think it's just sad. It saddens me. And I really hope that, both sides aren't holding anything back here and do everything that they can to keep this rivalry going.
Yeah, so again, a lot of layers of the onion to peel away here. So this is not a conversation where you can kind of say everything that is to be said in 1, 2 or 3 minute block. This is requiring several layers. So here's the first layer. One is, obviously Jen Cohen wants those automatic qualifiers, and to a certain obvious extent that makes sense. Like, let's get those 4 Big Ten spots guaranteed before we commit to a long-term deal. I think we can all understand that. But I think the skepticism of Jen Cohen and questioning why she's taking such a hard line in negotiations is this. Ethan, you and I would agree, I think most people watching our show here at the Voice of College Football would agree, that AQs or not, regardless of how many AQs, automatic qualifier spots, are in this playoff, we pretty much all agree this playoff is going to 16 teams next year. Like, the SEC is not going to settle for just 3 teams. The SEC definitely, after last year's humiliation, the SEC will want more bites at the apple, more teams in the field. That's why the SEC is, pursuing this plan of having 2 play-in games, 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5, which, by the way, is really smart. It's something I advocated for on a show with Mark Rogers, in the winter. But this is going to 16. And so the question, Ethan, is just how much should USC and Jen Cohen, so this talking specifically about Jen Cohen, since she's the one taking the hard line in negotiations with Notre Dame, just how worried should Jen Cohen be that, if we have a 16-team playoff, we really need that 4th automatic qualifier in the Big Ten to feel comfortable? Is that really the hill you want to die on, Jen Cohen? Is that really such a sticking point that you're going to take a hard line in negotiations with Notre Dame? Like, that to me is the first point of discussion here. You're USC. Are you really going to spend so much time worrying about a 4th automatic qualifier and being like a number 14 seed? Like, we need that number 14 seed. As you would say, that's not USC. That's not the culture of this football program. That's not the culture of this university. It really seems Jen Cohen, in her, as we've both said, understandable desire to protect USC's interests in its relationship with the Big Ten, which was the big investment, and that wasn't even something Cohen did. Like, that was Mike Bone putting Jen Cohen in that situation, but obviously Jen Cohen's trying to adapt to it. We get that. But really, Jen, do you need to be that worried about a 4th Big Ten spot and a number 14, 13 seed? Like, we're not SMU. We're not, like, for SMU, it meant everything to get into the back end of the playoff like that. USC shouldn't be worried about a back end seed in a 16-team playoff, right, Ethan Inman?
Exactly. I mean, you perfectly said what I was about to say. If USC is a program that has competed throughout college football history. It's not like Nebraska where they're competing 40 years ago for national championships. USC has competed for national championships in every era of college football since basically the beginning of the sport. So everyone's reaction to this number 1 recruiting class in 2026 is, this is the norm. This is what should be expected. This is not out of the ordinary for us. This is not a super special, achievement. This is what should be happening, because Southern California has the best college football talent, college football prospects of anywhere in the nation. And USC is USC with all of the resources that USC has and with all the history that USC has. So if that's going to be our attitude towards that, that should also be our attitude towards the rivalry. I'm sick and tired of, there's so many like USC creators on Twitter and social media too that are in support of canceling the rivalry to, like you said, like squeak into the 14th seed of the college football playoff. It's a weak move. And I'm tired of all the excuses. I'm tired of we have to travel to Indiana potentially a second time in the schedule. Like maybe you should have thought of that when you decided to move to the Big Ten. Like these are all problems that we've created for ourselves. And honestly, I think that they're good problems to create. I think that they're problems that showed back in 2022 when we made this move that we wanted to be competitive, that we wanted to take on some of these top teams like an Ohio State, like a Michigan, that we were tired of playing, a half full Arizona State and a half full Washington every year, at these stadiums with, and I'm giving Washington a little bit too much flack. Maybe Washington State would be a better pick, but these schools where the students don't really care about the football team and, they're very mediocre year in and year out. Like we wanted to play these historic blue blood programs. We wanted to play in the Big House. We wanted Penn State to come to the Coliseum. And we should, in the same vein, invite the kind of competition that Notre Dame brings. And so I'm sick and tired of the excuses and all of the just very silly, just the very silly like reasoning and cowardly, like, yeah, let's squeak in that shouldn't be the expectation. Like you said, we should expect to compete for national championships. And if not, we need to have a serious conversation about admitting that we're not at the top of the college football ecosystem anymore, which I don't think any USC fan is going to admit. So if we're not going to admit that, then we should be fully behind any move that seeks putting us in primetime competitive games as much as possible.
Okay, next question, next layer of the onion to peel away, because there's so many avenues that we have to explore here. So we're just going to patiently deal with them one by one here at the Voice of College Football. The next layer to this, Ethan, is, and you alluded to it a little bit in an earlier answer, but let's just tackle it head on right now. If USC beats Utah in the Pac-12 championship game, Caleb Williams doesn't get hurt, and the Trojans finish that win, and they make the playoff, are we sitting here at the Voice of College Football having this conversation about USC and Notre Dame potentially ending their series? And, if USC makes the playoff a couple years ago under Caleb Williams, are we having this conversation right now, Ethan?
Probably not. I think a big reason why, like I said a couple minutes ago, a big reason why we're looking at this rivalry even potentially ending is just the amount of success that Notre Dame has had compared to USC in recent years. And also, I mean, obviously Notre Dame is set up to have some more sustained success than USC is in terms of just the way that the college football playoff is set up in terms of the revenue that you receive, relative to each round you advance. And Notre Dame, obviously, being a conference-less school, gets more of that share of that revenue, whereas someone like USC, they're splitting the revenue between all the schools and all of that stuff. And just generally, the ecosystem that college football is currently in. Marcus Freeman's a great coach. Notre Dame fans have every reason to be optimistic, which USC fans aren't going to want to hear, but it's true. The one time that USC kind of had Notre Dame's number was that year in that 2022 season when Caleb Williams had a signature Heisman performance and they beat them in the Coliseum. So, and then the argument starts looking a little more even. Sure, Notre Dame made the college football playoff semifinals this year, and honestly, kind of a year where there was no clear top team. People thought that it was Ohio State at the beginning of the season, and they ended up finishing on top, which is something that we talked about a little bit last week. But it's not like they were consistently there. I mean, this is a team that lost to Michigan, a very, very mediocre Michigan team in the last game of the season. And, so it's not like, and scored like under 20 points. So it's not like Ohio State had the smoothest, undefeated sailing to the playoff championship. In the playoffs, they were very good, but getting there wasn't necessarily the smoothest of sailing. So it's not like years in the past when there's an Alabama or a Georgia that just blew through everybody. And maybe in a year like that where there's a more dominant team, maybe Notre Dame doesn't make it that far. So you're not, and then you have USC who makes it at bare minimum to a college football playoff semifinal if they win that year, because that was before the 12-team expansion. That was when it was still 4 teams. I assume that they likely get beat by whoever ended up being the number 1 seed that year. Or maybe if they play number 2 seed TCU, if that kind of works out, maybe it's a competitive game. But again, minimum college football playoff semifinal. And basically finishing in the top 4. You have Notre Dame finishing in the top 4 this year. You kind of call it even maybe. And you also acknowledge the fact that, there's some advantages for Notre Dame in this current era of college football, but there's also some advantages for USC given, we've talked to a great extent on this show about how NIL's coming into the picture is an incredible asset to USC in terms of the just way that they're able to recruit athletes across sports, not just football. So maybe you count it all even at that point, and you are looking at this as more of something that will be evenly split in the future, which I think they should be looking at anyway, given USC's 2026 recruiting class. And if you have confidence in this coaching staff and you have confidence in these recruits, then you should be considering it an even rivalry, and a rivalry that you can feasibly regain dominance in the near future. But it just seems like they're not looking at it that way, which is a real shame.
You really hit on something at the end there, that because USC has this awesome incoming recruiting class for next season, that makes Jen Cohen's squeamishness and hesitancy that much more puzzling. Because if USC is on the way back, and as reflected in recruiting rankings and getting our NIL house in order, the things that didn't happen in 2023 and 2024, but now it's all coming together. That just doesn't it's hard to wrap the mind around why USC would be if not necessarily would be worried. It's certainly USC is projecting the appearance of being worried, that's for sure. Whether USC is worried, we could debate that forever, but it's certainly the appearance of being worried. If you have the number 1 class in the country, why are you projecting the appearance of weakness? That really doesn't make any sense here. Among all the things that don't make sense, that's near the top.
Yeah, because talking about it in terms of PR is a good point to bring up, because whether Notre Dame is also not wanting to continue this so they can schedule some weaker opponents is not something that we obviously know about, but Notre Dame is at least putting out the appearance that they want this rivalry to continue. The athletic director has made comments to the media, and every report that we've gotten has indicated that Notre Dame is seeking a more long-term deal. So, and they are in a more of a position to do that kind of thing based on the year that they're coming off of, but they're doing a lot better managing the PR machine as well. So it's just not a great look for USC, and I hope that they can shore things up for sure.
All right, another layer of the onion to peel away here is, when USC and UCLA joined the Big Ten, obviously that was an earthquake. That was a seismic development. It was on the heels of Texas and Oklahoma going to the SEC. So it was another huge shakeup in the landscape. And of course, a lot of people outside South Bend, Indiana, outsiders, not the insiders at Notre Dame, but people on the outside felt, this is going to finally lead Notre Dame to the Big Ten. And that's something that never made sense to me, because as you said earlier, Notre Dame gets the whole pie. Notre Dame gets all revenues for its various achievements by being independent. So and the Big Ten's larger. So that means you're splitting the pie if you join the conference with more teams. So that just never made sense to me. But the point about bringing this up is, when USC made the decision, and again, in fairness to Jen Cohen, this was not her move. This was a Mike Bone move. Bone put Cohen in this position. But so we're relitigating not a Cohen decision here. We're relitigating a Bone decision. Also, Carol Folt as well. It seems that USC needed to bang the table for certain concessions when it joined the Big Ten. And I know that the Pac-12 was awful. George Kliavkoff, Larry Scott, and people were fed up. I was fed up. I don't know if you were. You probably were. And like USC wasn't getting the uneven revenue share that it certainly deserved as the bell cow money creating program in the Pac-12. So like USC had its nose rubbed in the dirt, and so getting out of the Pac-12 was a priority. I'm not trying to say it wasn't or it shouldn't have been. However, if you are going to go to a new conference and you do know that there are going to be various headaches, shouldn't Mike Bone and USC leadership, when they were planning this Big Ten move, shouldn't they have insisted on certain things being an automatic part of their new association with the Big Ten? And one thing you alluded to earlier, was scheduling and the grind and the logistics. One thing I mentioned a couple weeks ago on this show here at the Voice of College Football was, why in the world is USC flying to West Lafayette to play Purdue in September and then flying back to South Bend in the middle of October? Like, that is dumber than dumb. It makes absolutely no sense. Look, if USC couldn't get something common sense in stone, in writing from Tony Petitti, the Big Ten commissioner and the conference at large, if USC couldn't insist on and get a guarantee that, hey, if we have to go to Purdue or we have to go to Bloomington to play Indiana, we're playing Notre Dame in connection with that, either the week before or the week after, to not be able to get those kinds of concessions and now being worried about, the grind of the travel and the logistics. Well, again, this is not Jen Cohen, it's Mike Bone, it's also Carol Folt. But shouldn't USC have driven a harder bargain a few years ago? If you're going to go through the headaches of this move and the headaches that we're seeing right now, headaches that would not have existed if USC was still in the Pac-12, shouldn't USC have pounded the table and absolutely insisted on getting certain guarantees that it has not gotten to date in the Big Ten?
Well, it certainly seems like it. I mean, and to give USC credit, the only thing that I've seen about scheduling in terms of some of the reporting that's come out is that USC has tried to get the scheduling to move. It seems like USC wants to move the Notre Dame game to a little bit earlier in the season so that you can have I think, which bodes, two advantages for USC. Obviously, you can pair it with a game like the Purdue game, which you want to have earlier in the season, so it's not snowing. So that, again, that kind of makes sense. And also, it helps with this new college football playoff setup. You can overcome early season losses now with good late season performance and squeak into the playoff. So in that sense, it makes sense, because if you take a loss at Notre Dame in September, it hurts a lot less than taking a loss against Notre Dame in November or December, or November or October, excuse me. So in that sense, I get it. And that doesn't seem to be on USC. That seems to be on Notre Dame, who wants to keep it, at the same times, which again is tradition. Like, it's either in October if you go to South Bend, or it's on Thanksgiving weekend if it's in the Coliseum. That's historically how it's been. And I do give Notre Dame a little bit of credit for trying to protect the history if that's what they're after, and they're not trying to make it more difficult on USC, which they could be doing. We'll never know for sure. But yeah, there's a lot of things that don't make sense. I mean, it was one of the questions too from the beginning has been, while football is a sport that can charter these flights across the country, and the basketballs kind of are, what happens when like baseball has to play Rutgers? It's so there's all kinds of scheduling issues that didn't seem super well thought out, and we saw it in the basketball schedules this year too. I mean, both basketball schools both basketball teams made multiple trips to the East Coast and had, East Coast teams making, but East Coast teams only had to make the one trip. They hit UCLA, they hit USC, and then they left. So it's like, and I get that there's more schools on the East Coast in the Big Ten than there are on the West Coast, and all kinds of things like that. But it's definitely something that they're still figuring out. I hope that it's just growing pains, and I hope that the conference can figure some of these things out, and USC does have some power to try to, figure these things out now, even though it wasn't figured out ahead of time. But I don't know. I hope that they can figure it out, and it's unfortunate that it has come to this, but it doesn't. At least the Notre Dame game scheduling specifically doesn't seem to be USC's fault, but there's a lot of other factors that they could have figured out, obviously.